it's very weird seeing Keith floating like a human hoverboard above St Donat's Castle in the jousting field. It's making me feel a bit dizzy and a bit nostalgic at the same time, if that's possible. And just to kind of briefly recap, yeah, I was at AC in the mid 1980s. No mobile phones, same weather as ever, and it was the most kind of terrific experience. I really very much enjoyed it. Fantastic cohort of students and teachers, and I think what it did was sort of push me towards that sort of foreign correspondent route subsequently in my career. I mean, I learned German when I was there. I've hung out quite a lot with the Germans. I didn't learn Russian. I wish I had. And essentially what I did was, after AC, I went to Oxford, I read English literature. And then in the 90s, I went into kind of newspapers and joined The Guardian. Wow. I mean, a long time ago now, in 1996, you know, I've just been watching The Crown. I don't know if anyone else has been watching that on Netflix, but one of the first stories I did for The Guardian was the death of Diana. I then spent a year following around Prince Charles, who, by the way, in the 80s was a patron of the United World Colleges, and, you know, was sitting in the back of his plane as he was whizzing off to Canada and South Asia. And speaking among friends, he was clear he was kind of pretty pleased with the fact that the attention was back on him. And when I was in Sri Lanka and Nepal, I came across foreign correspondents who were in situ, who were wearing white linen suits, and it just seemed to me to be the most kind of glamorous thing to do, and also following on from all of the ideals and the whole concept of international understanding from the 1980s. So I lobbied to be posted abroad. I applied for Berlin. I didn't get Berlin, and I got sent to Delhi to be the Guardian South Asia correspondent in 2000. And this was kind of very much regarded as a rather, I mean, it's a huge, important region, but it was regarded as kind of down the news list story. And of course, then 9/11 happened. And I'd already been to Afghanistan under the Taliban, but I spent months in Pakistan, months in Afghanistan. And for a while through the noughties, I was the Guardian newspaper sort of war and death guy. So I did chronicle what looked at the time like the end of the Taliban. I was in Iraq for the invasion of Iraq, the US-UK invasion. I was in sort of Kurdistan in the north and did various stints in Baghdad until one of my colleagues was kidnapped. And it just became really kind of impossible for someone who, you know, to report very hard. And then in the summer of 2006, I was in Berlin covering the World Cup hosted by Germany, which was just the most fabulous, wonderful event, when my then boss flew in and said to me rather enigmatically, we think you need a bigger canvas. And what that meant was, I think essentially no one has applied for the job in Moscow. We're going to send you to Russia. And I was up for the challenge. I mean, I sort of, by this point, I had two small kids with my wife, Phoebe. We thought we were versatile, we were cosmopolitan. Like all of you lot, we spoke languages. And so I arrived in Moscow in early 2007 at a time of really profound acrimony, hostility between Moscow and London, and in the middle of a kind of blazing international row, because what had happened a few weeks previously was that Alexander Litvinenko, who had worked for the FSB, the successor spy agency to the KGB, had been poisoned in London with radioactive polonium by two Kremlin assassins. The British government had pointed the finger at Putin. Putin had said it was nothing to do with him. And I found myself trying to kind of make sense of this wonderful and complex country, run by pretty dark and I would say thuggish regime. And essentially, I tried, when I arrived in Russia, I sort of thought that it was perhaps a sort of semi-democracy that was moving slowly but inexorably towards becoming a kind of normal law-based state. And in fact, what was happening was the reverse, was that Putin, who was a sort of Secret Service KGB guy down to his fingertips, had really, really kind of squashed political opposition. He had sorted out the media. He had tamed, you could say, the oligarchs. In fact, what he'd done was bring those revenue streams inside the Kremlin and redistributed them among his kind of friends and cronies. And Russia was, I think by that point, was kind of the world's foremost spy state. And I sort of approached the assignment like any other. I tried to, I traveled to the North Caucasus, where there's a big underreported war going on between Islamists and local and federal security forces, very, very brutal on both sides. I tried to answer the question, how much money does Vladimir Putin have? Answer, he's the richest person on the planet. And he and his team are collectively worth many hundreds of billions of dollars. And I also tried to explore the role of the FSB, this powerful, shadowy spy agency, which it seemed pretty clear had murdered Litvinenko and was also repressing the Russian political opposition and so on, at a time when Russian journalists like Anna Politkovskaya were being murdered. So it was a fascinating story, and pretty quickly I found myself being kind of pursued through the icy streets of Moscow by what you can only describe as unpromising young men wearing cheap leather jackets and brown shoes, who would listen in on my conversations from adjacent tables. And it became fairly obvious that we were being surveilled. When I would call the foreign desk in London and make a joke about Putin, for example, as you do, then the line would be cut and there'd be a kind of ominous crackle, which sounded kind of like this. And so you make another joke about Putin and the line is recut, more crackling. And we had a series of break-ins at our family apartment in Moscow where things were kind of moved around in a really obvious way, windows left open. On one occasion, a sex manual deposited by the side of the bed, the marital bed. And I took advice from the British Embassy in Moscow and was told basically that we were being surveilled. There was nothing we could do about it. Our flat was bugged. It was the FSB. This was standard practice used against people regarded as being domestic irritants, used against diplomats, especially American and British ones, and so on. And we had an interesting time in Russia. I've written 4 books about it. But one thing I just want to make clear quickly is that my difficulties were always with the Russian state. They were never with the Russian people. I mean, Russia is a great country. There are Russian students at AC and at UWCs around the world. And it has, we used to see plays, listen to concerts. My wife, Phoebe, wrote travel articles. We would go to Tolstoy's estate and travel around Moscow and to Siberia and so on. And so I think it's very careful. It's very important when you're thinking conceptually about the world, about international relations, about Russia, that you don't confuse a great country of 142 million people with a rather narrow clique of essentially KGB people who have run the state and who hijacked it mostly for their own private purposes, which is to steal money. And so my Russia story ended rather unhappily in 2011. I came back for about 3 months to London to write a book about WikiLeaks and worked on a secret project involving the release of classified US diplomatic cables. Flew back to Moscow, was more or less flipped back at border control and deported out of the country. And then and I think barred. So far as I know, I can't go back. But then from London, I kept on, reporting on sort of Russian Kremlin themes, and what was useful was that I was sort of in Russia at a time when many of the techniques that we've seen internationally were being perfected domestically. So troll factories, cynical students employed to blog, post pro-Putin comments on Russian websites, wars of aggression. I covered the war with Georgia in 2008, and corruption on a huge scale, and also these theatrical political murders which were happening inside the country but also outside the country. I mean, Litvinenko was one, but we saw 2 years ago, we saw Sergei Skripal, and so on. I kept going with the stuff. I wrote a book about Litvinenko's poisoning, which came out in 2016 following a British public inquiry, where we got all of the forensic, scientific, technical, police evidence about this crime, this teapot crime. And it was a lurid picture of two quite bungling killers who left a trail of radiation all across London, but actually eventually got their guy. So I wrote that book, and then the same year, of course, twin ghastly things happened. We had Brexit in the UK, and we had Donald Trump. And like many people, many correspondents who know Russia, I was really kind of bemused by the fact that Donald Trump, as a candidate first time around on the election stump, said all of these kind of weirdly flattering, praising things about Vladimir Putin, about how wonderful he was, and so on. And this marked a complete break with the sort of traditional Republican Party view of Putin, which was the sort of John McCainian view that Putin was a cold-eyed KGB killer. And suddenly Trump was in a completely different space. So I started investigating his finances, his relationship with Deutsche Bank. By this point, I had a whole network of sources, some inside Russia, some outside. And at the end of 2016, I went for a drink in a pub in Victoria with someone called Christopher Steele, who's a former MI6 spy, enormously self-confident, of medium height, very good at eye contact, pretty good analyst of Russian affairs who had led the investigation into Litvinenko's murder. And I asked him about Donald Trump. He was very unhelpful, but encouraging, told me to keep digging. And then about 3 weeks later, it turned out that he had produced this dossier, essentially alleging that Donald Trump had been compromised by the FSB, by Russian intelligence, that they had tapes of him staying in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in 2013, frolicking with two prostitutes, and that there was a major multi-level espionage operation which happened in 2016 to help Donald Trump win. Some of the dossier is unproven. Quite a lot of it is true. We now know from Robert Mueller, from the special counsel's report, special prosecutor's report last year, from a recent Senate report in August. And this story became, I would say, the biggest international political story of the last few years, and still something of a mystery. I mean, despite all of my best efforts, and other people who've investigated this, Donald Trump's financial relationship with Moscow is still opaque, and he's certainly behaving like a KGB asset. I mean, whether he is formally that, or whether he's someone who just admires Vladimir Putin as a strongman, and the fact that he has this latitude to behave in an authoritarian way, we still don't know, but we may find out more in January when President Biden takes over. That's one of the things I'm pursuing at the moment. And then, I mean, just to kind of wrap up, then I was basically done with Russia. I thought, I'm not going to write any more books. Collusion had been a #1 New York Times bestseller, and I was thinking about moving on, and then various things happened. One was the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, which was essentially a sort of rehash of the Litvinenko case, with 2 killers flying from Moscow, this time working for Russian military intelligence, the GRU. And another crisis, another bilateral crisis between London and Washington, and also some astonishing evidence of these 2 guys getting the train, and then subsequently giving an interview to Russia Today, the Kremlin TV channel, where they claimed they'd gone to Salisbury on a day trip because they were beguiled by its enormously tall cathedral, and they had to turn back because of snow. I mean, these are guys who come from Siberia. And so there was a sort of darkly, it's not exactly comic, but there was a sort of shambling element to this story, which I thought was worth pursuing, and also to try and decode why Russia was still, or the Russian state was still murdering people. And I think the short answer is, it was a sign of contempt to the UK at a time of Brexit and growing international isolation. But it was also a warning to other people inside the Russian elite, and in particular working for Russian intelligence services, that if they collaborate with the CIA or with MI6 or with Western governments generally, that they can expect a kind of a terrible punishment at some point. So it was done to preempt further treason. So Skripal happened, and the other thing that really compelled me to write another book was Brexit, because the sort of British government of both Theresa May and Boris Johnson has been extremely reluctant to investigate, interrogate Kremlin meddling over the Brexit referendum. Now, I suspect most of you are probably not fans of Brexit. I'm not, for sure. But wherever you stand on that, whether you like it or whether you hate it, I think it's extremely important in an age of social media, in an age of dark money, of Facebook and Twitter and so on, that you get to the bottom of this. And you know, what I discovered essentially, and when I write about this in Shadow State, is there was as well as the operation to boost Donald Trump in America, there was a parallel operation to push Brexit in this country, involving quite a sophisticated spy operation run out of the Russian embassy in Kensington in West London, and featuring meetings between the Russian ambassador and Aaron Banks, who gave Leave EU, one of the 2 main Brexit campaign outfits, about almost 9 million pounds. And I'm still investigating that. Big scandal here at the moment is that Boris Johnson has made Yevgeny Lebedev, the former, the owner of the Evening Standard, the London Evening Standard, and the Independent newspaper, son of one of my best Moscow contacts, Alexander Lebedev, an oligarch and a former KGB agent or former KGB officer. Boris Johnson has made Yevgeny Lebedev appear, despite the fact that the British security services have said this is a bad idea. And I just discovered this afternoon that he's going to be Lord Lebedev of Hampton in West London and Siberia in the Russian Federation. And I would just say, sort of, you know, by way of closing before we move to questions, I keep on thinking about writing novels. You know, maybe I should write novels. I've written 8 nonfiction books. 2 of them have been made into movies. One of them has been turned into a play. You know, they're all being turned into TV dramas, whatever. And I think maybe a novel next. But actually, our times are so twisting and weird, and with plot lines that are just ridiculous. You know, Donald Trump refusing to concede looks as if he's going to stage his own parallel inauguration in January. I mean, if you were to present that as a scene to a literary agent, you'd be laughed out. It's just too ridiculous, and yet it's happening. And so, you know, I've been a firm believer in the kind of proposition that the best stories are true stories, and I try and tell them. And I think at a time of cacophony and fake news, when the truth is under assault from multiple directions, whether it's shadowy actors like Russia, or you know, malign forces, or just crazy people sitting on their beds, you know, trolling you on Twitter, I think we just need civilized conversations like this. We need to be calm. We need to be empirical, and we need to stick with the values and the ideals that we learned as teenagers, some of us quite a long time ago, back at Atlantic College or other UWCs. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Luke. Some quite intriguing stuff. We actually have a question from Tanja AC84. I'll just quickly run through it. How do you...
Tanja who? Which Tanja? Which Tanja?
AC84. Let me just unmute her. Tanja, can you hear us? I think he's just struggling to unmute her. 1 second.
There we go.
Yes.
Hi, Luke. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Actually, what a fascinating work life you've had, and I'm sure a very fascinating personal life. Thank you for sharing all of that. I might have a very vivid imagination, but I just can't help asking this question. How do you ensure your safety right now? I'm worried. I think what you're doing is hugely brave. And sorry, to answer your question, I'm 84. I'm Tanja McKenzie.
Of course you are. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Tanja. It's funny. I mean, I've done a lot of literary festivals over the years, and I normally get. I mean, yours is a polite variation of the question that I invariably get at every literary festival session, which is, why are you not dead yet? So you've basically asked the "why are you not dead yet" question, there's a good answer to this, which is that essentially, you know, having been through this pretty dark experience in Moscow, you know, like I said, which we loved the country, but didn't much like the government. I had an insight into the way that sort of Putin and the people around him think, and what they do really in any situation is to mirror think, and they're very Soviet guys, and they assume that any foreign correspondent, whether it's German or but especially British or American in Moscow, actually is a spy working undercover. So that you know, I'm essentially a MI6 operative with some literary ability who files my stories for the Guardian website by day, and by night sends some kind of encrypted message to the Foreign Office, you know, awaiting instructions about how to defame the Russian government, etc. I know it sounds ludicrous and conspiratorial, but in Cold War times, you know, correspondents for TASS, whatever, in Paris or Washington actually were KGB agents. It's one of the main. So they assumed that I was a spy, and paradoxically, that's actually quite helpful. I mean, it was ridiculous insofar as everything I do was open. You could read it. You know, I didn't have a Aston Martin. I used to take my kids or our kids to school in Moscow on the number 14 tram, and yeah, and my lifestyle was very unglamorous, I have to say. But the point is that they have one rule for dealing with foreign spies, and another for traitors who are Russians like Litvinenko or like Alexei Navalny, whom we haven't talked about yet, poisoned in August in Siberia, the Russian opposition leader. And the Russians, there's a spectrum. Anything can happen from nothing to you can be assassinated if you cross so many wrong red lines, etc. Or you can be busted by the tax police, or your daughter can lose her university place, or. But for foreign spies who are seen as kind of legitimate adversaries, you can be hounded, you can be kind of trolled. We had these apartment break-ins. We had this hilarious sex manual bookmarked to a page on orgasms, which I had to explain to my wife that it wasn't mine, that, you know, someone had introduced this. You know, it was in Russian. Anyway, but ultimately, you know, I was deported and my visa was annulled with a big blue stamp, and that was that. So I think that gives us some protection. And, you know, Chris Steele, I mean, of course, they'll try and hack him and surveil him. I mean, he really was a spy. He spent 22 years working for MI6. But I don't think they'll kill him. I mean, because the people they really, really hate are the Skripals of this world, the Oleg Gordievskys, the Oleg Kalugins, who was a senior KGB general who moved to America in the 90s and so on. They, you know, Putin has said famously, you know, traitors get what is coming to them. And it's sort of Jacobean. I mean, I think he actually takes pleasure from ordering or signing off on particularly painful and exotic forms of murder. Something quite existentially savage about it. But I think, fingers crossed, it won't happen to me. And just the last thing to say is, the brave people in the story are not, it's not me, it's the Russians. Opposition people, political activists, journalists, especially in the provinces. They're some of the bravest people I've met anywhere.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we have a question from Tony AC19, which follows on from that quite nicely. Tony, are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I was wondering if you've had any run-ins with some of the major intelligence agencies from like Russia, the US, and the UK, because obviously what you did with Collusion was a bit risky, to say the least. So whether they reacted in any direct way to what you were doing is my question.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, despite what all despite what the controls say, I haven't had anything really to do with British security services other than Christopher Steele, who I've just used as a kind of, I mean, he's not actually a spy anymore, but he's quite a good analyst. So I've talked to him about what's been going on in America and obviously about his dossier, and he features in my new book as well, Shadow State. So I kind of lay out the Steele thesis in Collusion and then revisit it a couple of years later to see how it stacks up. I mean, Donald Trump has tweeted abuse at Christopher Steele on more than 100 occasions. I mean, he's quite a self-confident guy, so I think it probably hasn't affected him too badly, but demoralizing. The Americans, no. Again, I've talked to a few people who were in the intelligence community, but they're all out. The FSB, well, I mean, the Russian embassy tweets abuse of me. They're quite funny. They branded. I don't, if you look at the Russian embassy in London Twitter accounts, it's, I've written a book called Mafia State. I've written a book called Shadow State. I mean, you could write a book called Troll State. They basically see diplomacy as essentially trolling people you don't like. And I did a story recently about the Alexei Navalny poisoning, saying that it were, quoting sources saying it was the FSB, as with Litvinenko. And there was a tweet last week from the Russian Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a big stamp saying fake news, denouncing my story. And this is another classic kind of Kremlin MO, is that you counter accuse. So the thing you are accused of, you then accuse the accusee, if that makes sense. So I mean, really the Russian government is very good at disinformation operations, both in Russian language media and it's got RT, it's got a whole series of outlets, some of which are pretty fringy, others of which make an impact. And the accusation level against me and the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on is that we're all fake news. And that might echo with someone else, the current outgoing president of the United States. And that's something else I tried to tease out in my books, is this synergy, this overlapping rhetoric between the Kremlin and Trump. And quite often, one of the things I really like to see are the top secret transcripts of the private phone calls between Putin and Trump. We haven't got them. We may get them. They're going to be a goldmine. I mean, future historians we're going to write lots of books about it. But I suspect what happens is that Putin, who's a classic and canny opportunist and KGB operator, will plant an idea in Trump's head. Like, for example, Ukraine tried to throw the 2016 election by helping Hillary Clinton. Trump then repeats it. Fox News then repeats it. And Trump then repeats what Fox News is saying on his TV screen. And it becomes this unvirtuous cycle with Russian disinformation being kind of repurposed in America by the Trump supporting right. And it's scary times. I mean, I was just listening to Barack Obama this morning talk on the radio, being interviewed, BBC Radio 4, talking about truth decay. And it's definitely true, where you have tens of millions of Americans who now live in a parallel cosmos where they believe that Trump won the last election in November, genuinely believe it, fervently believe it. And obviously it's damaging for our democracy. And it's something that any regime, whether it's the Russian regime or the Syrians or Senator Chuck Grassley or whoever, that the US far right can weaponize and instrumentalize. And that, you know, again, we as I said in my thing, you know, I'm very keen to sort of be part of what you might call an enlightenment fight back, you know, pro-truth. We need another enlightenment. The last one was a few hundred years ago.
Brilliant, thanks. There's actually two questions from two people that I think would be quite good to follow that on. From Hannah AC19 and Tangent AC2000. Firstly, what are your thoughts on the future of journalism and trust in news publications in this age of fake news and misinformation? And secondly, has your motivation to investigate been harmed by the decreasing value assigned to the truth on the world stage?
Okay, great questions. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, well, I mean, you know, journalism is in trouble. I mean, The Guardian is laying off. I was talking to colleagues this morning. We're laying off 70 journalists. We're doing it voluntarily because we have a pretty strong union and we have a no sacking agreement. But clearly, that's unpleasant for everybody. And we're in this strange situation where our traffic. I mean, The Guardian's readership, while I've been at the paper over the last 2 decades or so, it's gone from being a sort of successful, if niche, UK newspaper to being really a truly global news organization, you know, web-based, web-first media organization. And I would say, together with the New York Times, really the world's kind of foremost liberal voice. And the numbers we've been getting this year with the pandemic and with what's been happening in the US have been enormous. I mean, the weekend of Trump's defeat, we got the biggest traffic ever. I mean, we oh gosh, I can't quite remember the figures, but it was in the region of about 50 million people. Looked at the website. You know, and 20 years ago, we were selling perhaps 400,000 copies a day, and now we're reaching a global audience. We have a big office in Australia. We have a big office all across America. We are kind of 24 hours. You know, London will hand over to Sydney, will hand over to New York, and so on. And the appetite for our journalism, for kind of good, proper, fact-based, sensible, international-facing journalism is enormous. But the revenue stream has collapsed, and we're just being crushed by Facebook, by Google, and so we got a lot of we get a lot of money from people give us money. You know, we ask for our journalism to be supported so it can be free for everyone to use, regardless of their income. And about 1 million people do that now. Don't give money to The Guardian, you do read it. You know, give us 20 quid a year. I mean, don't give us your firstborn, but a little bit of cash would be good. So it's bleak, but there are a couple of bright spots. One is that we collaborate. One of the big trends in recent years is international collaboration. I mean, I was part of the team that did the Panama Papers.
So, Luke, I think
yeah, am I back?
Yeah, you're back now.
Oh, yeah. So working with ICIJ and Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany, and now we do these, because things like offshore finances and corruption, transnational. And so I work with colleagues all around the world. You know, I'll talk in 1 week, I'll talk to La Stampa in Italy, I'll talk to the Germans, I'll talk to American contacts, I'll talk to Russian journalist friends, some in country, some out. And we all help each other. I mean, the forces we're up against are so dark and implacable that we just collaborate. That didn't used to be the case. So that's a bright spot. And the other bright spot is this age of populism, this age of universal lying, this age of Trumpian monsters. Funnily enough, you know, I jump out of bed with a zing. There's just so much to do. There's so much corruption, including in our countries. It's not far away Russians doing bad stuff. It's corruption in the UK, which has got worse and worse, particularly under the Boris Johnson government. I mean, just look at procurement in the pandemic. It's incredible. So there's lots to go at. I don't think things are lost. Financially, it's bad. We just need people to keep the faith, give us a bit of money, and to leak us stuff. You know, leak, if you know any secrets, leak me, luke.harding@theguardian.com. The Americans are very good at leaking, and Brits not so much. We're all a bit, oh no, I can't, you know, whereas actually we need people to be gutsy and think first and foremost about the public interest.
Brilliant, thank you. Next up, we have Veronica Chamberlain, AC 71 to 73. Hi, Veronica.
Hi, yes, thank you. Hi, Luke. Yeah, I had the experience of living in Russia in the 1970s, having left AC, so I sympathise, and my friends from that era tell me that nothing has changed, absolutely nothing. I expect you'd probably agree with that.
Veronica, was your apartment broken into?
I was a student, so I was living in a student hostel, and my fellow roommates were writing reports on me every day, but we all knew that. So we didn't give them any useful material. We talked about very banal subjects when we were in the student hostel. So yeah, it was exciting times. I was arrested by the military for photographing military objectives, but that's beside the point. What I wanted to ask is really, do you see any hope? Do you see any development or improvement in Russian politics which gives you hope? And if so, where might it come from?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just to restate what I said at the beginning, that we need to be very careful about distinguishing the government from the people, and I think what gives us hope is probably demographics. That there's a younger generation who really are kind of unsatisfied with what's going on, who demonstrate from time to time. I mean, that's not to say that all young people dislike Putin. I mean, that's not true. Many like him and are comfortable with the status quo. But there've been big demonstrations from time to time in Moscow and St. Pete in 2011, 2012, and there's a pretty kind of vibrant grassroots opposition movement. Some of it is explicitly political. Some of it is to do with ecology, eco themes. Some of it is regional. There've been demonstrations going on for weeks now in the Far East after a popular regional governor was replaced by the Kremlin because they didn't like him. He was too autonomous. And so, I mean, formally, the situation looks pretty hopeless. I mean, Putin won over the summer a constitutional referendum, which means that he'll be able to lead Russia until 2034, by which time, I mean, I feel I'll be on a Zimmer frame by then, and he'll be in his early 80s. And it'll be a sort of Nazarbayev, the Kazakhstan leader or recent ex-leader, sort of style presidency. But who knows? Unexpected things happen in Russia all the time. I mean, the only thing I would caution against is that if Putin does go in unexpected circumstances, I don't see him being replaced by a liberal or someone who suddenly wants to improve relations with the West and democratize. I think one could have another kind of neo-Putin figure who will take over or try and seek to take over. And I think one of the very clever things about this regime, unlike some of its predecessors, is that a lot of the smartest Russians have left, actually, because it's porous. People I knew when I was there, people in the Russian opposition, for various reasons, gave up, went to go live in Lithuania, went to the US or moved to the UK or just got out because moved to Paris. It becomes so hard. So it's a clever regime, but nothing lasts forever. And really, no one predicted the fall of the Soviet Union until it happened. I mean, I know there were movements and there was thaw, but when it did happen, it happened rather quickly, and a lot of secrets came out. And I do have a sort of fantasy scenario in my head that in some kind of post-Putin future, I can go back to Moscow, see my friends there, and maybe go to the Lubyanka, the KGB FSB headquarters, and find my file, and see who was spying on me, who wrote what, and who exactly the guys were who kept breaking into our apartment.
Brilliant. Next up, we have Hugh Davies. Hugh, can you hear us?
I can, Keith. Hi, Luke. My question was really, it was more about the small countries on the periphery. And maybe another one, I was asking the question about Georgia, birthplace of Stalin. You commented on Georgia. So was really, and maybe another country that has St. George as its patron saint. You know, what role do these smaller players on the world stage have? Are they just being drawn in by Putin and his gang, or have they got a chance to play their cards more independently?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. It's a good question. I mean, so I covered the war in Georgia in 2008, in the summer of 2008 for The Guardian, and I write about it in Mafia State, my first Russia book, which I did after I got kicked out. And I think what you have to understand is that the Putin view and the view of people around him is that these former Soviet republics, whether it's Georgia or Ukraine, or indeed the Baltics, are essentially within Russia's sphere of influence, and that Russia has a right to, not to determine everything, but really to kind of call the shots on their foreign and security policy, which means, for example, making sure that they don't join NATO, which Putin regards as an eternally hostile, antagonistic bloc. And you know, Saakashvili, who was the president at the time of the war, it was a sort of the invasion, well, initially, you know, capture of South Ossetia, and then Russian tanks going into Georgia proper and heading towards Tbilisi. It was a sort of brutal lesson in realpolitik that, for all of his, you know, friendly conversations with George Bush and his transatlantic strivings, that the view from Moscow is that these countries, essentially the near abroad, is, you know, if not formally Russian, that the Russia can, you know, Russia as the great power can do what it likes, and Ukraine even more so. I mean, you know, I went to Crimea before it was annexed. I covered the war from the east of Ukraine, from Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, and saw this takeover, which was in part local, but also in part artificial and external, armed, pushed, propagated, controlled, you know, by Russia, because sort of Ukraine is central to this kind of imperial or neo-imperial vision of Russia as a kind of co-equal to America and an indispensable player on the world stage. And the problem for countries like Ukraine is that they just can't change their geography. And my view, whether you think it's naive or excessively idealistic, I don't know, is that ultimately it's got to be down to people and countries to elect people and to determine, you know, if a state is sovereign, to shape their own destiny. And it's interesting to see in Moldova, a country we don't write about much, that a pro-EU, pro-Western woman president, has just been elected this week, defeating the Russian leading incumbent. So Putin's view is that these countries are sub-sovereign, and I think his vision is essentially a 19th century vision where he would like nothing better than to, in an ideal world, meet with Donald Trump, maybe Angela Merkel as well, and divide the world up into spheres of influence. But you know, his role is to make Russia great again, to coin a phrase. And I think he's had more successes in that in recent years than the other guy.
Brilliant. We do actually have two questions, I think, that follow on very nicely from that. One from Paulina, any thoughts on what Putin will do with Belarus, as well as from Nick Danziger, to what extent will Russia involve itself in protecting Armenia?
Yeah, well, those are good questions. I mean, I'm not sure I have a super sophisticated answer. I mean, in Belarus, I think essentially, you know, we've been asking ourselves. I mean, I was actually in touch with Alexei Navalny's people today to try and get an interview with him. And I think one of the reasons that Navalny was poisoned in Siberia when he was in August is because the Kremlin is definitely spooked and jittery by what's happening in Belarus, because the implications for Russia are too obvious. You know, you have a president who has stayed in power for too long, who's gradually become unpopular and disconnected from his own people, and is relying on security forces and brute solutions to deal with what's a kind of popular insurrection. And this is the scenario that haunts Putin. I mean, it haunted him after Gaddafi got dragged out of a drain pipe in Sirte in 2011 and killed by an angry crowd, and it haunts him still. And I think, I mean, obviously Russia wants to influence Belarus. I think it would like to gobble it up economically in terms of oil and gas and so on. But the main thing is to avoid that scenario, and you'll see that the support for Lukashenko has been overwhelming, including from Russian state media, despite the fact that he's now extremely unloved and has dealt with protests absolutely savagely. As for Armenia, I mean, I haven't been to Karabakh. I was briefly in Azerbaijan in 2008. You know, Russia's doing this big peacekeeping operation there. I don't know. I don't think this is a conflict they necessarily wanted. The Russia necessarily wanted. Clearly, Russia didn't intervene to save Armenia. I think the most interesting aspect of that conflict, which I've just followed from afar, is the rise of Turkey. I mean, Erdogan is a very Putin-like guy, but both in his authoritarianism and his rhetoric, he's endlessly talking about enemies and you know, traitors, and his speech making is quite Putin-esque. But it's clear that Turkey has become a sort of serious regional power, and I'd be interested to see what happens next. It's very flammable, the South Caucasus and the North Caucasus. I don't think it's the last conflict we'll see there, and I don't think this current peace deal will actually probably see peace in the medium term.
Thank you. Next up, we have Judson SD Kendall. Hi, Judson.
Hi, how are you? This is Judd SD Kendall from AC 1968, sitting up here in Maine in the northeast corner of the United States, conveniently close to the Canadian border in case I ever want to make a run for it, although because of our response to the COVID pandemic, the Canadian border is closed. And of course, I'm sitting in limbo as I watch our election play out in this weird way where no one knows what's going to happen. And there are plenty of psychological explanations for what Donald Trump is doing, many of which make sense because he's a psychological mess. But a lot of his trails lead back to money. And so I just wondered, any insight into how desperate he is to conceal his Russian money ties? Is that anything going on here? Because of course everyone could come after him once he's not president.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I was talking to a very good source of mine who is, well, let's say he's kind of quite, he's not part of the incoming Biden team, but he's close to them. And they think that, I was saying, you know, why is Trump behaving so irrationally at the moment, even by his standards? And they just said there's a tsunami coming. I mean, there's the debt. $500 million is due pretty soon, owed to Deutsche Bank. Some of this, we don't quite know who holds that debt. That was one story I was pursuing in 2016. A lot of people, including the New York Times, have been investigating this, but there's been a suggestion which is formally denied that VTB, the Russian state bank, may have underwritten some of this money. In other words, the money ultimately, which is propping up Trump, is money from Russian state entities rather than from Deutsche Bank, which, by the way, was running this humongous money laundering scheme out of Moscow for many years, laundering money for Kremlin VIPs. Deutsche Bank is the most compromised bank out there. So these hundreds of millions of dollars due, and then these multiple legal actions. Even if he pardons himself or gets Mike Pence to pardon him, there are legal actions pending from women who claim that they were raped by him. That's one. There's the whole Michael Cohen thing, which once he loses immunity, will also come back, and the Southern District of New York can do that too. And there's the whole kind of tax mess. I mean, it's clear he hasn't paid any tax forever, and has had these kind of huge rebates. And seems to me there's a pretty strong prima facie case of fraud that could be made against him, stretching back a long way. And so yeah, I think the situation is quite existential. I mean, at the moment, a lot of people are worked up as to whether Trump will run again in 2024, whether he'll be kingmaker and so on. I can't see him running again in 2024. I think he's going to be in a whole world of trouble from January 21. And also, I wonder whether Twitter will deactivate his account the second he's out the door and tweets something which, but so I think there's a, you know, we can see it happening now, but I think there's a mighty fall coming. Whether he ends up in jail, we don't know, but it's going to require all of his ingenuity and his tricksterism to avoid going to court and avoid going down.
Yeah, thank you. Next up, we have Sheila from 1970. Hi, Sheila, can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear?
Yes,
Yeah,
we can.
Okay, I suppose it's, you've talked about the Russian involvement in the West, and the trouble is the damage is done already. We've got Brexit, we've had Trump. What can be done by us as citizens to protect the truth? You're providing some of that evidence, but what can we do to short circuit quicker the shocking involvement?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sheila. Thank you. I mean, there are no simple solutions to say first off. I mean, some of the things I mentioned already. I mean, support and promulgate good journalism. And also, I mean, for kids who get to AC, probably that you know that they don't need it. But I think we need sort of civics in schools. We need to start teaching like the Finns do, age 11 or 12, teaching kids to distinguish between a reliable news source and something which is dubious, so that becomes an integral part of education and our sort of social fabric. And also, I think we have to kind of recognize that. This corruption, as I was saying, is it's not far away corruption. It's corruption inside our own societies. I tried for much of this year to get hold of a copy of the Russia report. That's why I was complaining about people never leaking. No one leaked me the Russia report by the British Intelligence and Security Committee, which came out in August. But what it did was point out that London has become, in recent decades, has become Londongrad, and there's a whole heap of lawyers, of company formation agents, of real estate guys, of people working in PR and lobbying, peers of the realm, not just Yevgeny Lebedev, who have grown rich from taking Russian money. And I don't see any appetite from Boris Johnson to do anything about this. And another thing we need to do is we need proper tax. You know, we need large international corporations to pay tax. Which is what you and I do. But one thing I found from the Panama Papers, having spent 6 months looking at all of these secret offshore records, is essentially big companies and the global rich and super rich have exited from taxation. They don't pay tax. It's just like suckers, ordinary suckers who pay tax. And successive governments have allowed this to go on for too long. So we need good news. We need proper journalism. We need accountable politicians, we need a fair taxation system, and we need de-offshoreization. I mean, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, my colleague wrote about this week, Chancellor of the UK, has a blind trust. He's married to the daughter of a billionaire. You can guarantee some of his assets are held offshore. I mean, if the Chancellor can hold assets offshore, what examples does that set to everyone else? So I think we need to kind of clean up at home, try and safeguard the next generation or impregnate them a bit against all of this, malicious, toxic stuff. And just lastly, Sheila, I'd say we need to stay cheerful. We've got to be cheerful and be kind to each other and decent and have sort of lovely conversations like this. We need more decency.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got time for one last question. So it is from Wilhelm Reitman. Wilhelm, are you there? Hello?
Hello?
Ah, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think what I wrote as my question is, how do you explain then in your narrative the number of sanctions which were played against Russia, lately also against Germany, Nord Stream 2? Is this because Trump loves Russia or because he plays against Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I write about this, and thanks Wilhelm. I write about this in Shadow State. It's true that the US did sanction quite a few people after Sergei Skripal got almost murdered in Salisbury. But what's clear from not my reporting, but from the Washington Post and others, is that Trump kind of made a mistake. Basically, he thought that he essentially what he wanted to do was to match the European response. He didn't want the Europeans to do on him, and then he kind of subsequently complained. And the phrase the Washington Post quoted was there were a lot of curse words, apparently. I mean, I think if you look at Trump and Putin, even now, after 4 long, arduous years, Trump has said nothing critical of Vladimir Putin at all. And I don't expect him to, even out of office. It's a very strange state of affairs. And I don't know about you, but I just look forward to a period of boring under President Joe Biden, where I don't follow Trump on Twitter, but where he's no longer in your head and in your kind of informational space, where we can just, whether you love him, maybe you love him, I don't know, or maybe you don't, we can just have a break from this remorseless 21st century and just have normalcy for a while. I mean, that would do me, at least for a bit. And it's nice to think that you know, this age of populism, actually, you know, there can be some democratic correction, which I think is what happened in America this month. So let's believe in democracy. Let's say farewell to Donald Trump. And as I was saying to Sheila, let's stay cheerful and kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. And thank you to all the questions from everyone. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions, but we got the chat saved. So we'll share them with Luke and see if he has a chance to get back to us. But my colleague Magda has shared a feedback form in the chat. If everyone that attended today could fill that out, that'd be great. This will be, I mean, this has been recorded. So if anyone that missed it or wants to hear back anything, it's on our YouTube page. But yeah, thank you, Luke, for the talk. It's been great. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it just as much as I did. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, we've got a couple more before the end of the year and into 2021. And have a great sort of rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you. See you all. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Cheers.